Good. Well, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today to focus on the human rights situation in Russia on the margins of the 47th session of the UN Human Rights Council. Right at the start, I want to highlight that we have the opportunity to listen both in English and in Russian using the interpretation at the bottom of the screen. So please take advantage of that if you would like. I'm Matthew Jones, working with the Human Rights House Foundation, and together with our co-organizer, the Permanent Mission of Poland, and the 19 co-sponsoring permanent missions and NGOs, we would like to warmly welcome you to this opportunity today to examine the current human rights situation in Russia, and particularly the increasing human rights challenges that independent civil society faces in the Russian Federation today. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions during today's side event via the chat box. Please feel free to take advantage of the opportunity at any stage during the meeting. We'll do our best to address these at the end. Finally, this event is being streamed live via Human Rights House Foundation's YouTube page, and a recording will be made available later thereafter. We're also aware that delegations are very busy and this the last full week of the Human Rights Council session. And while we have a number of very distinguished speakers today, will not go over the 90-minute mark or 3 p.m. Geneva time. Now, many of you will be aware that 45 states signed on to a joint statement at the 46th session of the Human Rights Council, highlighting concern for the deteriorating situation of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the Russian Federation, manifested in particular by the unlawful detention, arrest, and imprisonment of Alexei Navalny. Also at the 46th session, 85 Russian and international human rights organizations issued a joint letter calling on the United Nations Human Rights Council to respond robustly to the recent crackdown by the Russian authorities on independent civil society and dissenting voices in the country. The letter detailed a range of legislation being rapidly passed in Russia, capping its decade-long attack on civil society space and dissenting opinion. Finally, I mentioned that the High Commissioner in her opening remarks to the Human Rights Council this session highlighted the situation in Russia and said that she was, and I quote, dismayed by recent measures that further undermine people's right to express critical views and their ability to take part in the parliamentary elections scheduled in September, unquote. So the key focus of today's side event is to get a closer look at the situation on the ground in Russia. What does it look like for civil society? What are the key challenges with respect to its international obligations? And particularly, given that Russia is now a member of the Human Rights Council, what should the Human Rights Council do to address these growing challenges? Our distinguished panel is primed to address these questions. And so let's immediately turn to them. First, to two special procedures mandate holders who will provide an independent international view of Russia and its obligations, and then to some of our civil society colleagues. To begin, it's my real pleasure to turn to Mary Lawler, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. Thank you so much for joining us today. Madam Special Rapporteur, in your most recent report to the Human Rights Council at HRC 46, you identified the most serious issues affecting human rights defenders, including threats and killings. Indeed, in Russia today, many human rights defenders work under constant threat and intimidation. And this is often the reason why Russian human rights defenders themselves are afraid to speak out at an international level. What is your view on the challenges that human rights defenders face? And what are your recommendations to Russia and to the Human Rights Council to better support Russian human rights defenders? Madam Special Rapporteur, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Poland and Estonia and all the other states co-sponsoring this event today, and particularly to Human Rights House Foundation for inviting me to speak on the rapidly deteriorating environment for human rights defenders in the Russian Federation. I should say at the outset that my focus is exclusively human rights defenders, and I hold Russia to the same standards as on human rights defenders as I hold the other member states, including all of those co-sponsoring today. The invitation is timely, as just last week I organized a hearing with over a dozen human rights defenders from all over Russia and Crimea to hear about the biggest challenges they were facing in their work and what more international actors could do to support them. And this hearing will be on the Special Rapporteur website, SRHRD's, I think it is. Regardless of where in Russia or Crimea they were from, the common thread uniting them was that none of them felt protected, yet all continue their human rights work, knowing full well that they are playing with fire for doing so. Like so many other human rights defenders who have said the same, they expressed frustration, anger, and fear at the continued strangulation of civil society, including through the introduction of and amendments to ever more restrictive laws. Most recently, the ironically named Law on Enlightenment Activities bans any educational activity which has not been approved by the state. In such a context, promoting awareness of international human rights standards suddenly becomes risky in itself. Not that an additional law like this was needed to target human rights defenders. I heard how laws like the so-called Foreign Agents Law practically impact defenders. Semyon Simonov, a human rights lawyer, is expecting a verdict in his criminal trial to be delivered on Thursday. Semyon is facing up to 2 years in jail for non-payment of fines his human rights organization received for failing to register as a foreign agent in 2017. Over 20 hearings have taken place. He has been dragged off trains and placed on an exit control list, all for doing work to protect the rights of the vulnerable and running human rights awareness raising training programs. I heard about the particular challenges faced by women and LGBTIQ defenders and how shockingly common it is for them to receive death threats. They do not receive any form of protection, even if they overcome the fear of reporting such threats to the authorities. In one case, a woman human rights defender who runs a shelter was raided by police in Dagestan, and she was forced to flee the country temporarily after receiving messages threatening her. Defenders get prosecuted for non-violent speech on social media, but aggressors do not even get investigated for death threats. In light of this situation, what can be done? Firstly, it's clear to me that the Russian government does care about its international reputation. If it didn't, then it would not attempt to prevent human rights defenders from interacting with the UN human rights mechanisms. One human rights defender from Crimea told me last week that when travel was possible, she would regularly get approached by police telling her she should stay at home if she wanted a happy, peaceful life instead of going to Geneva. This was after she had been bundled into a van and threatened, so she knew these were not empty threats. Another indigenous defender from Eastern Siberia related how his profile page in his passport was cut up when he was at the airport on his way to participate in a UN panel on indigenous peoples. This tells me that it is crucially important to keep the spotlight on Russia and on the human rights defenders who continue to do their work despite the risks. While resourcing them directly has become more difficult, the value of expressions of solidarity and moral support should not be underestimated. Secondly, if states are serious about their intention to help civil society in Russia, then they must get serious about the issue of visas. A number of defenders have told me that given the context, the risks they face, and the pressure they're under, they do sometimes need to leave the country temporarily as a security. But they highlighted the reluctance of European countries to issue them visas or exercise any degree of flexibility on the rules of entry during COVID, even when grave risks are being faced. I would like to emphasize this point and ask the state representatives present today to note it. In my experience, defenders do not want to leave permanently, but a temporary relocation can save lives or give the break needed to allow them to return with renewed energy to their work. Lastly, it is essential to keep talking to human rights defenders in Russia and be guided by them in terms of what support is most useful. In such contexts, I often hear that states do not engage or have minimal engagement because of the potential risks to the defender. But I don't think it's up to states to say whether or not it's safe for a defender to meet with them. Human rights defenders have agency, and they carry out their own risk assessments on an ongoing basis. As long as states do highlight the possibility of reprisals for interacting with them, then it should be up to the defender to determine what is the best for them. I will finish by quoting a woman human rights defender who was on the call last week, and she said, "Not everyone is afraid of foreign agent status. The international community should continue to fund human rights defenders and NGOs who want it. They should continue to support those who are already active and working in Russia." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur. And in fact, many of those themes that you touch on will be picked up by other panelists and potentially by some of the co-sponsors as well. It's now my pleasure to turn to Clément Voulet, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the freedoms of peaceful assembly and association. Mr. Special Rapporteur, in the High Commissioner's opening remarks to the 47th session, she said that, and I quote, "Legislation restricting the freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly, and association should be brought in line with international human rights norms and standards." She further urged the Russian authorities to end the arbitrary practice of labeling ordinary individuals, journalists, and non-governmental organizations as extremists, foreign agents, or undesirable organizations, unquote. Mr. Special Rapporteur, you've published a few statements in recent months on the widespread crackdown on peaceful protests in Russia. What is your view today on the situation of peaceful assembly and association in Russia? And what are your key recommendations to Russia and to the Human Rights Council? Thank you, and I give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew. Let me first thank the organizer and co-sponsor of this event. I think there are too many of them for all to be named in the short speaking time that I have. But I would like especially to thank Human Rights House for bringing us all together. I would like to echo Mary Lawler's concern regarding the closing of civic space in Russia. And my intervention will be focused more on the protection of this, the freedom of peaceful assembly and association rights in Russia. As you all know, the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association are guaranteed by the Article 21 and 22 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And these rights are essential pillar of any democratic society because they enable individuals to express themselves collectively and participate in shaping their societies, and are also instrumental in advancing human rights, the rule of law, democracy, peace, and sustainable development. So the protection of this fundamental freedom requires that states create and enable a conducive environment for their exercise, but also that the states align his practice to the international human rights standard. So when these rights are not guaranteed or are unduly restricted, the civic space is narrow and the democracy itself is undermined. This is what is currently happening in Russia. And I just wanted to give you one of the few examples that we recently engaged with the government. In February 2021, I, together with a group of other special rapporteurs, sent a letter of allegation to Russian governments regarding the violation of fundamental freedom in the context of the nationwide protests that were organized on 23 January 2001 in response to the Ms. Navalny arrest and trial. This letter you can see is a public and it's an OSHR website. So according to the information that we received, over 4,000 peaceful protesters were arrested across the country for their participation in the assembly on 23 January 2021. And at least 5,500 protesters were arrested during further protests on 21st January and 1,500 protesters on 2nd February, which is quite a lot. And furthermore, there were also numerous allegations of excessive use of force by police officers against protesters in various cities, including severe beating with baton and truncheon. We expressed our concern to Russian authorities at the arrest of several members of political opposition and supporters of Mr. Navalny, both in the day leading up to during the 23 January protests. We express also our concern at the allegation of government effort to restrict the operation of social media platform in the build-up to say protests and to restrict the holding of assembly. And in this communication, we also call Russian government to take action to cease the police brutality against protesters and to investigate the excessive use of force and hold the perpetrators into account. Until today, it's unclear if any of these allegations or to alleged instances of excessive use of force have been investigated. And even though we have many cameras that coach some of this excessive use of force. Another also concern that we expressed to the Russian government is also the use of COVID-19 measure to prevent the protests from happening or to intimidate people that COVID-19 measure will be used against them if they organize protests. And as most of you know, in response to the global misuse of the COVID-19 measure, I expressed my concern in April 2020 by launching a set of 10 guiding principles which provide recommendation to the government. The main idea of these 10 principles is to avoid that COVID-19 measure is used to restrict the space of the democratic space or to undermine fundamental freedoms. I don't have another also issue that we raised as a concern with the Russian government, which I'm not going to detail because I'm sure other panelists will be talking about that and we will have some discussion, is also the issue of foreign agent law, which we know which has been there for almost 10 years and which have been used against civil society and today have kind of chilling effects because of this law, many civil society, I think Mary mentioned that some of them have either to leave the country or refrain from organizing their legitimate work as human rights defenders. As you also know, the recent blocking of Mr. Navalny party as extremists is also another example that raised some concern. And because this is this is an example of attack against freedom of association. And as many of my colleagues and myself, we express, it is important that the legislation against terrorism do not be used against the legitimate work of civil society or the legitimate operation of political party. So, in all, I would like to say that I still remain concerned really about the human rights situation in Russia, and especially the space of political parties to conduct their activity and to be able also to ensure that their supporters also participate in public life. I'm also very concerned about the space that civil society have today in Russia to operate, because the law on the current legal environment is not conducive for civil society in Russia to conduct their activity. And I call the government of Russia to align its legislation to the international standard. Now that Russia is a member of the Human Rights Council, it's important that the government show its willingness also to uphold to the human rights standard. That's really important. And overall, I'm also calling the Russian government to also ensure that people have this ability to hold assembly, to request assembly, to be able to conduct assembly without any excessive use of force for law enforcement. It is important that Russia, as a powerful country, shows its commitment for human rights, but also its commitment for peace, for international peace, but also for the internal peace, by really putting in place all the measures that will allow political parties, civil society to fully participate to the democracy and also building up of human rights in the country. So I would like to stop there and hope that we will also, during the conversation, come back on some of the specific issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur. And you mentioned the Foreign Agents Law, and I know that your mandate has previously reported, for instance, on access to resources. And I think it's fair to say that the recommendations, when that was reported on, are just as valid today as they were when they were published a few years ago. It's now my pleasure to turn to Vladimir Milov, Russian opposition politician, civic activist, and aide to Alexei Navalny. Mr. Milov, earlier this month, following closed hearings, a court in Moscow ruled that the Anti-Corruption Foundation, led by the imprisoned opposition figure, Alexei Navalny, was an extremist organization. It also ruled that the Associated Citizens' Rights Protection Foundation and Navalny's nationwide network of political offices are extremist. Earlier, a law was passed prohibiting people involved in the activities of outlawed extremist organizations from running in any election. As someone who has closely worked with Mr. Navalny, what is your perspective on all of this? Is it possible to express dissent in line with fundamental human rights in Russia today? Mr. Milov, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for having me on this panel. And it's really hard to describe the realities of modern day Russia if you don't live in it and you do not feel it yourself. But I will try in a few minutes. And the major point is that essentially all of the major aspects of independent civil activity are becoming rapidly criminalized in Russia. First, the previous speaker, Special Rapporteur, had discussed freedom of assembly. Now, we have switched for several years already to a de facto permissive regime of public assembly, because you can even read it in Russian court decisions or hear it in the public remarks by Vladimir Putin. They interpret this regime as that you have to get a permit from the authorities to assemble on any political or civil causes. And that is in grave violation of the constitutional principle of freedom of assembly, where permits are considered, even by the existing law, as directions from the authorities, so that your rally does not interfere with other major events and maybe shall be moved somewhere. No, Russian authorities interpret the regime for assembly as permissive, and they have introduced a specific criminal article, 212.1 of the Criminal Code, for which several of my colleagues are being tried right now because they have been issued several administrative fines for violating the permissive regime of freedom of assembly. Now they are facing years in prison for that. All of the other activities across the spectrum, like independent media activities, de facto criminalized through, first and foremost, this foreign agents law, which grossly misinterprets the whole concept of foreign agent as it is being used in other countries. So if you simply receive a single penny from abroad on your bank account, regardless of what the purpose of that was, you can be declared foreign agent regarding all of your activity. And effectively, organizations which face the foreign agent label, they are facing a perspective of a shutdown, because there's a heavy bureaucracy surrounding the foreign agent status, and they are normally issued enormous fines, which they simply cannot pay, after which several organizations have already been de facto shutting down their activity because of this financial pressure associated with the foreign agents law. I mean, I can list all this for hours. The law on undesired organizations, you can essentially jail everyone for like standing in an elevator with a person who works for an organization that is declared undesired. There is also no clear legal ground for which organizations can be included on the undesired list. Authorities can do that at will. There is no open criteria. You also mentioned the ruling against Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation, declaring it extremist. Important feature is that this process is closed to the public. So the materials which were submitted by the authorities actually blaming that Navalny's network is, as they say, involved in extremist activity, they're not disclosed. They're classified. The public does not have access to them. And Navalny's colleagues have published most of these materials. Essentially, there is nothing even remotely indicating that Navalny and his team are engaged in anything even closely aligned with extremist activity. Vladimir Putin has been openly accusing Navalny and his network of teaching people how to prepare Molotov cocktails, but there is nothing about that in the criminal complaint filed by the authorities, because this never happened. This never happened. Navalny was always firmly standing on the principles of legality. His political party has been officially denied registration 9 times, consecutively 9 times, by the Russian Ministry of Justice, which is also a matter of consideration in the European Court of Human Rights. Now, there's the other aspect which I want to mention, that there is a growing extrajudicial pressure on independent society, because courts, criminal complaints, and prison terms and administrative arrest, that's one thing. The other thing is all kind of forms of extrajudicial pressure, like raids, opening criminal cases where investigations go nowhere, but they allow to exert certain pressure on people, pressure on employers, pressure on lenders of property with purpose to shut down the opposition or independent civil activity. Many other forms of intimidation. One of the important things is the thriving system of libel lawsuits, which are fake. They're usually filed by the authorities or people connected with them. And there are 100% cases decided in favor of the authorities and affiliated people. And these libel lawsuits usually are followed by, multi-billion claims and damages, and this is financially destructive for anybody who is operating in an independent civil sector. So effectively, if you take a look across the board, what happens in Russia these days is a systemic attempt through various means, absolutely the myriads of new forms of legislation which criminalizes all of the, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of political activity, plus different forms of extrajudicial pressure. All of this leads to a systemic attempt to a shutdown of any dissent, of any independent civil activity in Russia, not only political. Most of the political prisoners, as declared by the memorial human rights organizations, are people associated with religious organizations. Jehovah's Witnesses in the first place, they are not even political. So this is a systemic effort from the Russian government to shut down independent civil activity. And the main thing which I wanted to conclude with is that you cannot really find any justice in Russian courts. In almost 100% of cases, Russian courts decide in favor of the authorities. there's a clear formula they always include in court decisions that there is no reason not to trust the claims by the official agencies, representatives of the police, security services. So there is clearly no due competitive process. The courts only rubber stamp the decisions made by the administrative authorities, and you can see that by Russian complaints overwhelming the European Court of Human Rights. Russia is leading in terms of complaints, and most of the complaints related to independent civil activity, they are decided in favor of the members of civil society against the authorities, because there's clearly a bias in decisions of Russian courts in defending the authorities against the members of independent civil society. And I think it's one of the very important issues to be addressed at the international level. The Russian judiciary does not even remotely work properly. It only defends the authorities, and it is used as a tool against the independent civil society systemically. It's 100% dependent on the authorities' will. So I think it's important. This issue is probably the most important to be brought at the international level, because with all these forms of pressure, it is not possible inside Russia to find ability to defend yourself through courts, through judicial system, because of its total dependence on the authorities. I will finish here, but again, the point is that we should not look at some specific cases, Navalny case or others, but we should look at a broader picture and a systemic effort by the Russian authorities to effectively criminalize any form of independent civic activity which is happening these days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Milov, and point certainly well taken in terms of the actors involved. It's now my pleasure to turn to Olga Sadovskaya, Vice Chair of the Russian Committee Against Torture and member of the Executive Committee of the World Organization Against Torture, OMCT. Ms. Sadovskaya, you have many distinguished years of work addressing some of the most challenging human rights violations in Russia. How do you see Russia's response to allegations of the most serious human rights violations today, including the issue of torture? What are the key issues and trends that we should be aware of? You have the floor.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for all you being here and listening to the story of the US-Russia. Recently, last week, human rights organizations from member states of OSCE region presented the results of the first measurement of torture index. 8 states, Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, and Ukraine, were included into the selection. And the experts from those countries have measured the index using different measurable indexes. As a result, Russia scored nearly 0 and is located in the middle of the list. Authors of the report noted that there is no explicit prohibition of torture in Russian criminal law, and that quality of investigations depend on operational support from offices of the police and intelligence services. In terms of international treaties, Russia has ratified the main conventions, but has neither signed nor ratified the optional protocol to UN Convention Against Torture. And furthermore, the Manual on the Effective Investigation and Documentation of Torture, known as Istanbul Protocol, has not been built into national legislation until now. 3 years ago, Committee Against Torture, my organization, coordinated the submission of alternative reports on the implementation of Convention Against Torture and other inhuman and degrading treatment of punishment, where one of the key points was the indication that Russian legislation is not in line with international treaties, leading to several problems in the prevention of torture and other ill treatment actions. Back then, we highlighted the persistent and numerous reports indicating a lack of prompt, impartial, and effective investigations into allegations of torture and ill treatment. Many such allegations are rejected by the investigation at the stage of verification during the preliminary investigation, and thus don't lead to the formal initiation of criminal proceedings, and no justice to the victims. The UN Committee Against Torture itself also regretted the lack of detailed information on the number of complaints received of torture and ill treatment by public officials, the number of complaints investigated, and any criminal proceedings initiated against those responsible. In particular, as a result of the lack of a dedicated article in the Criminal Code of Russian Federation. Following the examination of the reports, the UN Committee Against Torture made concluding observations on the sixth periodic report of Russian Federation, which inter alia stated the following. Until now, Russia has not yet criminalized torture as a separate offense in the criminal court. And the definition of torture in the note to Article 117 doesn't contain all the elements set in the Article 1 of the Convention Against Torture. We are very concerned that acts of torture or ill treatment by state officials are usually persecuted under Article 286, excessive authority, which doesn't reflect the gravity of the crime of torture and doesn't enable the committee to monitor whether the state party is persecuting cases of torture at all. That said, the other forms of torture which are not covered by Article 286 and which often fall outside the purview of law enforcement, although they nevertheless leave an indelible mark on the life of the victim. I therefore once again urge Russia to criminalize torture as a separate offense and to ensure that the definition of torture fully complies with Article 1 of the Convention, so that the punishment for torture and its legislation reflects the gravity of that crime, as set out in the Committee's General Comment Number 2, dated back to 2007. Moreover, in recent years, we have been seeing a bifurcation of practice in torture cases into those involving participants in mass protests and people who have been tortured not applicable to freedom of assembly. We have seen several waves of mass protests in 2019 and 2021. And always afterwards, we received many reports of police misconduct against protesters. But these cases have not yet gained adequate traction in the Russian courts. Many human rights organizations have filed quite a large number of crime reports on the use of unlawful violence by law enforcement officers at public events. In the end, they were not registered as complaints. They were considered as citizens' appeals, and the investigative committee didn't carry out any checks. There are the cases in which the investigating authorities refuse to initiate criminal proceedings, and this is a typical story for torture cases. And there are individual cases of violence at rallies where the investigative body doesn't not even refuse to investigate, but pretends to have misread the crime report. And this is not a report at all, but a simple letter. Another problem that both human rights and legal communities call for is the extremely low compensation for the victims of torture and ill treatment. At the last session of UN Committee Against Torture, Russian delegation stated that this issue was being developed. While welcoming the delegation's statement on the preparation of a draft law on a compensation for victims of torture and ill treatment and detention, we are very concerned about reports that victims of torture rarely receive compensation at all, and that even when compensation is paid, the amount is minimal. There is no statistical data on compensation and rehabilitation services provided to the victims of torture and ill treatment. Referring to General Comment Number 3 of UN Committee Against Torture, I want to urge Russia to ensure that all the victims of torture and ill treatment, as well as the relatives of missing persons, are provided with redress, including adequate compensation and rehabilitation, including in the cases where the perpetrator has not been identified or convicted for the crime committed. The state party should compile and provide the committee with data on the total number of the requests for the compensation made, the number granted, and the amounts awarded by the court. In conclusion, I just want to say that the official state rhetoric continues to assert that torture in Russia is not supported by the authorities. And by the way, it is still prohibited by the national constitution. However, the practice of recent years clearly shows that the number of convictions for torture have decreased significantly. And at the same time, the sentences imposed for it have decreased seriously as well. And at the end, I would like to draw the attention of all countries involved into support of the event, that in Russia we have pressure not only on human rights defenders, not only on torture victims complaining on police violence, but also on those who support human rights defenders' work. I would like to draw your attention to the case of Mikhail Vasilevich, a person that was imprisoned for just supporting human rights activism in Nizhny Novgorod and is in jail since January in my city for presumable cooperation with undesirable organization that never happened in reality. And that was a result of mistake, of misunderstanding by a journalist in publication in a newspaper. And I would like to stress out that requests from your countries could help to save a person's life who is absolutely ungrounded, imprisoned for nearly more than a half year for doing nothing. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Sadovskaya. It's now my pleasure to turn to someone else with a strong legal background, Kirill Korotiv, Head of International Practice at Agora International Human Rights Group. Mr. Korotiv, you've heard the comments just now of Ms. Sadovskaya as well as the other panelists. Agora is really well known for its important work on landmark human rights cases in Russia. Can you tell us a little bit about the legislative trends that you're seeing in Russia, and also the trends in politically motivated criminal and legal persecution? You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was asked to speak on the legislation concerning NGOs and civic activity, and so I will start firstly from administrative pressure. And in the last year or so, especially in the last 6 months, from the very end of 2020, we've seen the extension of foreign agent laws to the domains previously uncovered by them. Also, the extension of the application of that law and the extension of the undesirable law. Undesirable organizations law, and the response of Russian courts, with which I will deal with, also was to rubber stamp all the administrative decisions. So the extension of foreign agents law, it was first done to cover media, and if an NGO had to have foreign funding and political activity, the notion of political activity has consistently been interpreted by Russian courts to include any text on the website. So with the media, you see the second criteria does not even apply. The media, by definition, produces texts on websites. So the only thing that mattered is foreign sources of income, which, again, applicable to virtually all media in Russia, but it's not how the law was applied. I will turn to that a bit later. The legislation on media was also extended to foreign agent individuals. And then also the legislation on NGO for an agent was extended to individuals. So an individual can be a foreign agent under, for example, a media law and an NGO law. So you can be a media foreign agent or an NGO foreign agent, but individually. And also the foreign agent law was extended to to unregistered groups of individuals without them forming a legal entity. Now that laws have seen increase in the intensity of their application. There was some sort of a lull when the cases before the European Court of Human Rights were communicated. There are like 70 NGOs waiting for the European Court of Human Rights judgments for over 8 years now. After the written pleadings were over, the administrative repression was back on track, and we've seen in the last 6 months the foreign agent law being applied to a domestic violence advocacy group, Насилию нет, No to Violence, to a social science research group, to a doctors' trade union, again to LGBTIQ plus organizations, particularly those working with HIV positive individuals. and it was extensively applied to media. So several major outlets like Medusa and V Times were declared foreign agents. Most strikingly, probably, the law on media foreign agents was applied to 5 individuals, one of whom is a Soviet dissident and a very renowned Russian human rights defender, Lev Ponomarev. Then there is a modern contemporary artist, Daria Apakhonchich, and 3 journalists working with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So a very diverse group of people. We have not yet seen individual designated as foreign agents under NGO law and unregistered groups designated under NGO law. So these are 2 domains where the administrative repression is likely to enter in the days or weeks or months to come. Now, I must say that the law on undesirable organization has been extensively applied. So undesirable undesirable NGOs are those who are foreign and who threaten Russian national security. So from the recent practice, who threatened Russian national security? These are not, armed groups which may be somewhere on the Russian borders. These are Association of Schools of Political Studies, Bard College, German-Russian Exchange, Deutsch-Russische Austauschung, Oxford-Russia Foundation. So you see, this law is being applied to international academic exchange, so that Russian researchers, Russian students will have less opportunities to have international work, international careers, international education. That is the consistent pattern of the application of that law in the recent months. And it's also being extended in that Russian and also foreign nationals are now liable under that law for the participation in the activities even abroad. So Russian Federation extends or aims to extend its laws, especially undesirable law, to any activities even outside Russia. And it is telling that Russian internet censor, the Roskomnadzor authority, with every, it not only blocks the websites of undesirable organization, it also seeks to, it also asks the foreign social networks like Twitter, Facebook to block their accounts on their social network, so that this account would be inaccessible for anyone, anywhere. And that is worrying. Now, last thing on that, the Human Rights Committee back in 2015, dealing with Russian, in its concluding observations on the 7th report of the Russian Federation on the ICCPR, heavily criticized the foreign agents law, and it invited Russian authorities to basically to repeal it. Now, I've been referring to those concluding observations in courts for the 5 years since, as the trials go, and no Russian court ever has even replied to the concluding observations, so that however detailed your submissions on that point are, the court will just not even bother to answer them. And that is telling, I think. So there is no Russian court judgment saying, for example, that Human Rights Committee was wrong. It's just they never entertained the argument. So this is the situation with these two laws and the judicial treatment thereof. There are also multiple criminal cases on peaceful protests and the extremist legislation. And there are possibilities to now bring criminal prosecution for the participation in the activities of undesirable NGOs, which is probably our near future. And I will just echo what Special Rapporteur Mary Lawler said in her opening statement, to which I totally subscribe, is that the COVID also means Iron Curtain from both sides, so that the current situation with international travel is totally unacceptable, and the decision of European Union countries not to allow Russian nationals holding visas, even if vaccinated, is something that endangers the safety and security of Russian human rights defenders, because that safety and security is guaranteed by the whole infrastructure of free travel as we knew it, like hundreds of international flights daily. Now it is just wholly unreasonable that European Union accepts Russian nationals holding residence permits without even vaccination, but doesn't accept Russian nationals holding visas but vaccinated. It is beyond my understanding, and it considerably contributes to the sense of insecurity, which is, of course, created in the first place by all the laws and the way they are applied, as I mentioned. So here, probably not so criminal as you asked, but that's, again, what I think I needed to say.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Korotiv. It's now my pleasure to turn to the last of our panelists, Galina Arapova, who is Director for the Mass Media Defense Center. Ms. Arapova, we've touched on some of the specific challenges facing independent media in Russia today. As a practicing lawyer and someone who works closely on the issues of freedom of expression and freedom of information, including yourself taking cases to the European Court of Human Rights, how does the situation in Russia look to you? Is it possible to openly report on politically sensitive news in Russia today? And what are the effects of recent legislation targeting free expression? Ms. Arapova, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a kind invitation to join this very important event. And I would echo my colleagues who already underlined restrictive trends in different areas of regulating Russian civil society and human rights. And I would add a little bit to the picture, saying that unfortunately, situation of media freedom in Russia continues to be of concern. And although Article 29 of Russian Constitution guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of press, Russian media unfortunately does not consider itself free, being pressured by constantly introduced new restrictions. And we see that Russian media community and civil society and human rights defenders, and as quite rightly my colleague Kirill Karatev just said, they all are facing several challenges in freedom of expression. In particular, we see that multiple attempts by the government to limit freedom of expression and restrict media freedom by adopting repressive laws recently. We see on daily basis selective repressive application of these laws, in particular cases by judiciary and law enforcement bodies. And unfortunately, I have to stress serious lack of impunity and fair justice in the country. Scope for media freedom and freedom of expression in general in Russia is shrinking very fast. We observe this for the scope of like 10 years, but the speed of this shrinking, unfortunately, is going faster and faster during recent months, starting from December last year, when the whole package of restrictive legislation was passed by the parliament. Many of them have been restricting freedom of expression and access to internet and possibility for journalists to report freely on different issues of public concern. Russian authorities has enacted series of restrictive laws and pursued policies that gravely violate the right to freedom of expression, particularly targeting political opposition, civil society, human rights defenders, and journalists. And foreign agent legislation and undesirable legislation that my colleague Kirill Karatev mentioned is very bright examples of these new restrictions. New legislation initiatives and newly adopted regulation restricting freedom of expression and internet are mainly aimed at strengthening governmental control over the media, internet, and free flow of information, silencing investigative journalism, which makes them rather destructive and seriously limiting freedom of media and silencing critical voices. I would underline a few examples which, to my mind, show how state of situation in media field is in Russia at the meantime. Newly created legal framework puts unprecedented pressure on media, internet, and freedom of expression. And once defamation was decriminalized in 2011, a lot have changed in this field. And now we see that criminal defamation is used against critical voices and journalists more and more, and harsh sanctions have been introduced in December 2020, up to 5 million of rubles for libel and up to 5 years of imprisonment. We see that very restrictive legislation have passed on personal data protection, jeopardizing investigative journalism as such, and limiting possibility to publish information about corruptive judiciary and officers of law enforcement bodies. We on everyday almost every day we see cases of extrajudicial blocking of internet websites, including for defamation. And just recently, President Putin signed amendments to the law which give powers to block information, defamatory information, without any prior judicial oversight. And then a person concerned can just request blocking access to this publication, and then media outlet would just have to challenge this decision for many months or maybe even years to get control over their website once back again. So this will create a situation when number of millions of publications of which could be totally lawful, legitimate, and covering issues of public concern would not be accessible for readers. So we see that such selective implementation of laws is supported by lack of justice and made challenging violation of media rights in the court of law quite useless or extremely difficult for practicing lawyers. We observed a series of searches and houses of independent journalists, particularly journalists which practice in investigative journalism. And this is something that I would particularly stress because it's important from both sides. It's a positive trend that investigative journalism is developing in Russia. We see that now more and more projects and media outlets are publishing investigative pieces on issues of public concern, on high-level corruption, and at the same time, authorities and law enforcement bodies are taking actions against this independent investigative journalists. Just last week, houses of 3 journalists from investigative media called Project.media have been searched, and all equipment and data storage devices have been seized. Journalists are under quite questionable criminal investigation within the defamation case, which was initiated 4 years ago. So this is just an example of what journalists are going through. And another issue that it's important to mention here, that legislation provided serious restrictions on covering protests by media, and just within few days, in end of January and beginning of February this year, when it was series of protests all over the country to support Alexei Navalny, over 500 reporters have been detained, arrested, or fined for doing their job, for covering public events and protests in different regions of Russia. And this is something that is supported by restrictive amendments to the legislation, which provide more possibilities for law enforcement bodies to check journalists and target them once they cover public events. So this is quite serious, and we see that this trend is strengthening when the parliamentary elections in September are approaching. And the very last point that also is quite important when we talk about freedom of media and freedom of internet is strengthening possibility to conduct surveillance over journalists, activists, and Russian internet users, since adoption of the whole package called Yarovaya package, named after a member of the parliament, Irina Yarovaya, who was one of the initiators of these legislative amendments. So this legislation allows full control over online communication, not just metadata, but actual content which people share, send to each other, download, upload. And this is something that is extremely dangerous when it comes to the guarantee to freedom of expression, access to information, and privacy. And the very last point is about fake news. Fake news, when a pandemic was all over the world, and many countries used this trend to support governments to control spread of questionable and not sometimes fake information, providing people with not always correct data and information on pandemic. Still, this legislation have been strengthened in Russia, and criminal liability for fake news have been introduced last year, and this criminal liability was already used against journalists and citizens of Russian Federation who was actually publishing information which they considered as important for public. And this criminal liability also contains a possibility to imprison people for up to 3 years. So this as a package, as a whole trend, definitely gives us lots of grounds to be concerned about situation on media, freedom of expression, and internet. So I'll stop here, and thanks for your attention, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Arapova. And that completes our lineup of panelists. But before turning to a statement from the Permanent Delegation of Poland and some of our co-sponsors, I'd like to first turn to Oleg Kozlovsky with Amnesty International for their immediate reaction and to provide some recommendations for further addressing the human rights situation in Russia. Amnesty were among the 85 organizations that co-signed the letter on Russia at HRC 46, and it would be good to hear from them now on some of their reflections and for them to present joint recommendations made on behalf of several organizations. Thank you for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Matthew. And first, I want to thank organizers and all participants of this discussion for their attention to the human rights situation in Russia. As the panelists described, and I completely agree with their vivid descriptions, it is both, the situation is both very serious and is also steadily getting worse. As a key regional player whose actions and policies are often emulated elsewhere, and as a member of the Council, Russia should not expect to escape scrutiny for its human rights violations. On the contrary, it deserves more of it. And today, jointly with other organizations, including Human Rights House Foundation, FIDH, and Human Rights Watch, as Matthew has mentioned, we issued an open letter to permanent missions in Geneva. In this letter, we welcome the March statement of 45 delegations, note that the crackdown has since only escalated, and urge further steps to ensure and protect human rights in Russia. We call on the Council to condemn the politically motivated persecution and harassment of activists, peaceful protesters, journalists, and others. We also call on the Council to urge Russia that it immediately stops these actions that clearly violate both the International Covenant and the European Convention on Human Rights. Alexei Navalny, Mikhail Yasilevich, Andrei Pivovarov, and all those detained for peacefully exercising their human rights must be immediately released and cleared of their politically motivated charges. Russia should stop using its laws on foreign agents and on undesirable organizations to violate freedoms on freedom of expression and freedom of association. And this includes the labeling of independent media outlets like Medusa and V Times as foreign agents. Of course, the laws and bills that violate Russia's international human rights obligations should also be repealed. The scale of the crackdown is much larger than a single side event could ever cover. Arrests of activists, police raids, politically motivated trials and convictions became a daily routine in Russia. Supporters, friends, and family of activists are also targeted. For instance, when this event is over, I will go to a court hearing where Oleg Navalny is facing years in prison for simply calling for a peaceful protest against unlawful prosecution of his brother. And yet, in spite of this tremendous pressure, we see that the Russian civil society, activists, journalists continue their peaceful work. So it is time now for the Human Rights Council to take action to hold Russia accountable for its human rights record. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that statement from Amnesty and for those joint recommendations on behalf of a number of organizations. I was wanting to immediately turn to the Polish ambassador, but I think we're struggling just to get, he is available, I'm being told. Good. Without further ado, we're going to turn now to some interventions and questions from our co-organizer from the Permanent Mission of Poland, followed by some of the co-sponsors of this event. We'll turn first, of course, to Poland, followed after Poland by Lithuania and then the United Kingdom. But just quickly before we do, I want to remind colleagues that if they want to put any questions forward to the panelists, please do enter them into the chat box. I'm not sure that we'll have time today to come to answer your specific questions. If we don't, we will look at other ways of taking forward those questions that you pose to the panelists. I also want to very quickly, on behalf of Human Rights House Foundation and Poland, just thank all of today's co-sponsors, specifically Amnesty International, Civic Solidarity, Civicus, Human Rights Watch, the Permanent Missions of Australia, Canada, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, France, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Norway, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the permanent delegation of the European Union. I'm sure you'll agree It's important that so many stakeholders are concerned about the human rights situation in Russia, and we're really grateful for your support. I'll now invite the permanent delegation of Poland to take the floor. Ambassador, thank you for joining us, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, during the previous session of Human Rights Council in March, I had the honor to deliver a joint statement on the deteriorating situation of human rights and fundamental freedoms in Russia in the context of Alexei Navalny's case. The following weeks and months proved these concerns expressed by 45 UN member states to be more than justified. Sadly, legal actions against a number of journalists and media outlets, arbitrary arrests of dissident activities or municipal deputies, and further legal restrictions concerning so-called undesirable organizations or foreign agents continue to be increasingly used by the Russian authorities, with a chilling effect on the civil society and media. Today's event gives us an opportunity to hear the very voices that are crucial to protect and respect human rights in every vibrant democratic society, and to express our support to their unhindered activities. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very grateful to the broad group of states and NGOs whose cooperation facilitated this event's organization. I would like to thank all panelists for their valuable and very interesting contributions. Referring to our distinguished panelists, I would have two questions. First, what actions can be undertaken by the Human Rights Council to address the concerns discussed today? And second, do you see a role of other international human rights fora to focus on this matter? I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Since I also see that we're joined by the Lithuanian ambassador, we'll turn to Lithuania next, followed by the United Kingdom, and then a video statement by the European Union. Ambassador, if you're with us, you are. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And many thanks to all organizers, co-sponsors, and panelists of this very timely event. The human rights situation in Russia raises our great concern. Legislative and police measures continue to shrink the civil society space. NGOs are routinely labeled as foreign agents, undesired organizations, banned, expelled, or denied registration. Independent media voices suppressed. Opposition politicians harassed and persecuted, up to and including assassination attempts. Criminalization of Alexei Navalny's anti-corruption network as an extremist group comes as just a new example. These developments stem from the same source as Russia's aggressive policy with regard to other UN member states, including breaches of territorial integrity of Ukraine, Georgia, and the Republic of Moldova, aggressive espionage, cyber and info attacks against foreign countries, institutions, etc. Russian government has long been challenging the key principles of democracy, human rights, and international law-based world order. As September Duma elections approach, we call on Russia to release Alexei Navalny and all other arbitrarily detained opposition politicians and activists, even out the electoral play field, and ensure effective participation by ODIHR observers. Rescind legislation limiting civil society space and enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and start abiding by its international obligations. And we call on the Human Rights Council to duly address the human rights situation in its member Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll now turn to the United Kingdom, followed by a video statement by the EU delegation, and then the United States. But first we turn to Ambassador French. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. The UK is pleased to co-sponsor this important and timely event. As we've heard, we have seen a systematic crackdown on human rights and fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Russian constitution, with widespread consequences for Russian civil society actors, opposition figures, and other dissenting voices. Recent actions by the Russian authorities mark a concerning new deterioration in Russia's civil society space. They show a blatant disregard for Russian citizens' rights and freedoms and neglect Russia's international human rights commitments. The Moscow City Court's ruling of Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation and political networks as extremists is a deliberate attempt to outlaw genuine political opposition in Russia. New legislation bars individuals involved in so-called extremist organizations from running for elected positions for a 5-year period. This appears to be carefully timed and coordinated to prevent specific opposition movements participating in the September States Duma elections. This trend is also evident in recent moves to expand the scope of the Foreign Agents and Undesirable Organisations laws, as well as new listings under both laws. As we've heard in terms of the recommendation of some of the panellists, the UK will continue to condemn these politically motivated actions, but I'll be very keen to hear further what more individually states can do and international communities can do to support Russian civil society in the face of these increasing restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we'll now have a short video statement from the EU delegation, and that'll be followed by the permanent missions of the United States and then Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The European Union condemns the limitations on fundamental freedoms in Russia and the shrinking space for civil society. The more restrictive legal framework, suppression of independent voices, and limitations on fundamental freedoms in Russia impose major constraints to the work of civil society. A number of human rights activists and independent journalists have left the country. In view of the steadily worsening operating environment for human rights and civil society organizations in Russia during the last years, the EU has continued its support. EU Action for Russians covers a broad range of areas, including support for universal rights, media literacy, youth, women, gender equality, and social inclusion. Our support has been crucial for Russian civil society organizations to continue their activities despite a very repressive and further stifling environment. In the conclusions adopted by the European Council on 25th of May, EU and its member states stressed the need for people-to-people contacts and continued EU support to Russian civil society, human rights organizations, and independent media. The Commission and the High Representative are preparing options on taking work forward in this regard. The EU will continue to support people-to-people contacts and civil society unabatedly as an investment for the future. I thank you.
Thank you. And we'll now turn to the United States, followed by Denmark and then Ukraine. The US mission, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this important event, which the United States is so proud to co-sponsor. We are deeply concerned by Russia's continued attempts to restrict the universal human rights and fundamental freedoms that people across the world cherish. The Russian government's drive to stigmatize, harass, and even criminalize independent non-governmental organizations with which it disagrees reflects its widening crackdown on political opposition, civil society, and independent media. It is an attempt to control and to silence dissent. We all have the right to speak freely, to form associations, to gather peacefully as a community with those who share our views, and to have our voices heard through free and fair elections. The people of Russia are no different. They deserve the same. Alexei Navalny, other opposition politicians and their supporters, human rights defenders, independent journalists, religious minorities, they all deserve the same. To the distinguished panelists, how can we increase the focus on protecting Russian civil society and the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all Russia's people through our work in Geneva? Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll next turn to Denmark, followed by the permanent missions of Ukraine and then Germany. Denmark, if you're with us, you have the floor. Yes.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you very much to all of the panelists for their very insightful remarks. Denmark is greatly concerned about Russia's increasing negligence of its international obligations, and not the least as concerns respect for human rights. Repression of critical voices and restrictions of human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of expression and assembly, is unacceptable and deeply worrying. We must continue to raise our concerns in our engagement with Russia and maintain focus on the human rights situation in international fora. This also concerns our demand for the immediate and unconditional release of Mr. Navalny. We're approaching elections in Russia, yet at the same time we are witnessing the introduction of new legislation that seeks to eliminate the non-systemic opposition. including Mr. Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation. Can the panelists elaborate on what you expect from the elections in terms of pushback to the shrinking civic space? And will Russians participate, or will we see an increased political apathy as a result of the restrictions on human rights? And thank you once again for being able to take part in this event. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll turn to Ukraine, if the permanent mission is with us, followed by Germany, and then we'll have a statement from Human Rights Watch. Ukraine, if you're with us.
Yes, thank you, Michael. We thank the permanent mission of Poland, Human Rights House Foundation, and the panelists for this important discussion. Ukraine is strongly supportive of democratic aspirations around the world and is ready to back any meaningful efforts aimed at promotion of democracy and human rights in our region. We are deeply concerned by continuing deterioration of human rights situation and democratic backsliding in Russia, and consider it one of the fundamental challenges to stability and well-being in Europe. We see increasingly authoritarian Russia, which is getting more and more out of line with universal human rights standards and international law in general, as an existential threat to Ukraine and other neighboring countries. A state like Russia, where fundamental freedom are just an empty sound, individual liberty is seen as an obstacle, and human rights defenders are considered extremists, is more likely to disregard any norms and principles and engage in aggression against its neighbors. Ukraine is a country with a first-hand experience of dealing with this phenomenon, being forced to counter Russian aggression for the last 7 years. Which brings me to my question to the panelists. What are the chances that the realization of democratic aspirations of the Russian people will lead to return to their country's compliance with international law, namely through the occupation of illegally seized territories of Ukraine and Georgia, compensation for other crimes of Russia's current authoritarian regime against its neighbors? I thank you.
Thank you. And we'll now turn to the permanent mission of Germany. You have the floor.
Thank you. We would like to thank Poland and the civil society organizations for organizing this timely event, and of course the panelists for their important contributions. We are pleased to be a co-sponsor of this event. Russia has committed itself to high standards of human rights. It has to respect its obligations, including decisions by the European Court of Human Rights. However, we see more and more development that lead to shrinking spaces for civil society in Russia, including human rights defenders. Yesterday, the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe has published its opinion on the latest amendments to the foreign agents legislation. And recently, we have ourselves witnessed the chilling effect of the law on so-called undesirable organizations in our bilateral civil society cooperation on human rights, when 3 German NGOs were blacklisted. We expect Russia to fulfill the human rights commitments it has taken upon itself, no more and no less, and to allow its civil society to participate in international cooperation and to work towards protection of human rights in Russia. My question to the panelists, given what we have heard about the current situation, what future do you envisage or expect for civil society organizations in Russia, and how can the Human Rights Council continue to raise awareness of the situation of civil society in Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not sure if the permanent mission of France is with us and wanting to take the floor. If you are, you're more than welcome to take the floor now.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. At the outset, let me thank you. Thank the permanent representation of Poland and all the co-sponsors of this relevant and very timely event. We're very proud to co-sponsor it. And I also wanted to thank our great panelists, very insightful presentation and quite sobering. Let me say that in our perspective, human rights are universal. We should, and they should be held to the same, all governments should be held to the same standards. And I think what we have today illustrates a worrying decline in public freedom in Russia. In particular, with particular concern by the so-called foreign agents and undesirable organization legislations, which is very detrimental to civil society and independent civil society and NGOs. These measures are part of a crackdown on foreign NGOs, Russian NGOs, independent media, and opposition movements. And of course, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, his arrest and imprisonment, the dismantling of his organization, and the pressure on his relatives are serious and worrying human rights violations. So France reiterates its attachment to the freedoms of association, peaceful assembly and expression, and calls on Russia to comply with its international commitments, in particular with regard to the rule of law and fundamental rights. My question to the panelists is how best can we help human rights defenders in independent civil society in Russia? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're going to turn very briefly, I'm conscious we just have a couple of minutes left, to a very short statement from Human Rights Watch, one of the co-sponsors as well. Human Rights Watch, if you're there, you have the floor. Okay, we seem to have some technical problems there. Unfortunately, we had hoped to be able to come to a proper Q&A, but we've run out of time, and I do want to finish on the top of the hour out of respect to everyone here who I know some colleagues have other obligations and other meetings to attend at 3 o'clock. But I just want to conclude by saying, first of all, that we've collected all of the questions that have been given to the panelists, and we'll look at ways that we can follow this up in the coming days. And I also want to reiterate some of the recommendations. I've just been told that Human Rights Watch are there. If we can then very briefly give them the floor.
Apologies for the technical difficulties.
No problem.
Solely wanted to reiterate the concerns and asks by our colleagues from Russian human rights organizations. Indeed, the country is swept up in the worst human rights crisis in its contemporary history. And now is indeed the time for Western democracies, for the European Union member states, the United States and Canada in particular, to speak on those issues in one voice and to use every opportunity, every meeting with their Russian counterparts to raise the situation with civil society and push for a change. And the well-being, the safety of Russian human rights defenders and journalists whose situation is incredibly dire at the moment should really be at the forefront of all international efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And that's actually a very good note to finish on. And I just want to remind delegations that we've joined the recommendations that were made earlier by Amnesty. They're published in full, both on our website today, on Amnesty's website. I believe Human Rights Watch will also be publicizing those recommendations. And I just want to conclude by thanking all of our panelists, by thanking the Permanent Mission of Poland and all of our co-sponsors again. You'll find a full recording of this meeting on HRHF's YouTube page, both in English and Russian, later today. It's been an incredibly important discussion, and I really am very grateful to the panelists for your contributions, and we will look at ways of working with you and with Russian civil society to move forward on the recommendations that you and others have put forward to today. So thank you for joining us, and I wish you a good day and a successful completion of the 47th session of the Human Rights Council. Thank you and goodbye.